Thank you everyone to come to the GLASSNET second early career researcher workshop. So we already had the first one on September 21st, 2022, and it was about the successful proposal. And then today is the second workshop. We're focusing on successful interdisciplinary research. And then we plan to do a third one, but likely will be in January 2023. So stay tuned in, and we will send your more information about the third workshop maybe later this year. And then GLASSNET, for those you're not familiar with GLASSNET, it is interdisciplinary research network. Was founded by a project through SF, the AccelNet program, and then we aim to accelerating the interdisciplinary research on sustainability solutions for land and water resources. So it's a network of network. We do have some exciting activities throughout the program years, and then one of them you might be interested will be the travel funding opportunity. So if you have a interesting research proposal idea and want to get connected with other researchers in the network, and then want to further develop it through the network, you can submit it to our workshop number 3, and then we'll follow up if you are selected to be funded by our project. And you can find the more information about the GLASSNET by Google GLASSNET Purdue or Google GLASSNET My GeoHub on the website. And you're welcome to subscribe our mailing list, which will email newsletters, upcoming activities, and we have training and funding, travel opportunities, and we hope you can get connected with us if you haven't. So we also want to announce some upcoming AGU sessions, organic sessions in December by GLASSNET. So mainly there were 2 sessions, one on Wednesday, another on Friday. And the first one is the town hall session. It will be a 1-hour event later Wednesday to talk about the networking global to local to global analysis to inform sustainability investment in land and water resources. So we have 3 speakers, and we'll provide catering. So hope to see many of you at this informal gathering event. And another one is an oral organized session. It will be on Friday night. And then, but early Friday morning, we'll have some online poster sessions and discussion of the online sessions. So that will be from, I think from 9 a.m. until 1:30 in the afternoon. Yeah, so if you plan to go to AGU, feel free to stop at those sessions and get engaged with our speakers. And finally, it's the time to introduce our 3 excellent speakers for today's workshop. They're Dr. Catherine Kling from Cornell University, and Dr. Alex Ruane from NASA, and Dr. Ben Gramig from USDA ERS. So I'm so thrilled to have those speakers. They are great to speak on 3 topics for this workshop. So we'll have them talk about how to come up with a research idea for your interdisciplinary project, and then they will comment on how to remove the technical barrier, so to make the collaboration more smooth. And then finally, some of you may have the opportunity to lead interdisciplinary research project. So our speakers will hopefully give you some practical ideas about how to manage leading very diverse interdisciplinary research group. Without further ado, I think we'll start the first presentation by Dr. Kling. Dr. Kling is a professor at the Ruane University, and you can see her full titles on her website. But I know her because of her very well-known research on water quality, and especially National Academy Sciences event on reducing the health impact of the nitrogen problem early 2021. And we're so fortunate to have her today as the first speaker. Kathy, are you ready to speak?
I am.
Thanks, you.
Jing. So I'm gonna share. I assume I can share my screen here. Great. So welcome everybody. I wish we could all be together and I could have a cup of coffee with each of you to get to know who you are, a little more about your background. But doing it this way lowers the barriers and costs to everybody. So it's a good thing to be doing. Anyway, my name, as Jing said, I go by Kathy. So if you ever see me, please say hi, Kathy, not Catherine, because I'll think my mother is yelling at me. So I thought about the task I was assigned was formulation of research ideas that engage multiple disciplines. How do you do it? Where do you come up with these ideas? And that was kind of fun for me to think about over the weekend, because I thought, well, how did I get into this interdisciplinary business? And so what I decided to do is I have a series of slides that are going to talk you through my story, because I know my story. I know how I became interested and involved, but I'm always a little hesitant to tell other people how they should do things, because everybody is so different and has such interests and so on. So I'm gonna kind of start, just sort of tell you the story of where I started when I was working on my PhD, which was very disciplinary. I had no notion of working closely with those in other disciplines. And then I've got 3 projects that I've worked on over the years that are increasingly interdisciplinary. And I thought I would sort of introduce you to those briefly and kind of tell you the story about how they came about. And because that's kind of at least the way I could think about how best to answer this question. So with that, and I guess all questions are being held till the end, right, Jing? I was just about to say, feel free to interrupt, but I think I'd be breaking the rules. So don't break the rules. We'll have lots of comment and question at the end. Okay. Let's see if I can do the proper screen share. And it looks like I may have achieved. All right, how's that? You see full screen view of my talk? Yes, thank you, Tom.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so there's a bunch of crap on here, so please don't. But I'm actually kind of old, so it takes time to get through all those years. So I got a PhD in a general economics program. In retrospect, I probably would have fit a little better in applied econ or econ, but I didn't know any of that back at the time. And I got extremely fortunate with the program I chose at the University of Maryland, because they were one of the leading places at that time in environmental economics. That was utterly unknown to me when I applied to graduate school and went there, but there was some very Wally Oates and Maureen Cropper, Nancy Boxtel, Ted McConnell, just a host of really top environmental economists. I got my PhD, and my first job was in California. Everything I did there was what I would say purely disciplinary. I was an environmental agricultural economist, and I wanted and to publish in the journals that were that discipline. So that's what I focused on entirely. I worked with some co-authors, but they were all economists. So when I got tenure, I began to think about what kinds of things I was interested in working on. And I started at UC Davis just before I left for Iowa State to sort of talk to some of the folks in the Transportation Institute. And in retrospect, I can see that that was kind of the first little foray I made. And that was where engineers came to me and said, we need an economist to help us think about the environmental aspects. I went to Iowa State, directed the Center for Ag and Rural Development. And while I was there, I got really interested in the agricultural, environmental, water quality issues, and realized I need to understand the land use issues. I need to understand something about the agronomy. I need to understand something about actual water quality. And so I sought out people to help me understand. And it wasn't really my goal at that point still to do interdisciplinary work. It was just to be doing my work better. I'm now at Cornell, and now I'll tell you the story of, as I said, a few of these research projects, but over this period of time, I've become very much enjoying and interested in doing interdisciplinary and policy relevant work. So when I moved to Cornell in 2018, I'm now in a proper applied economics program. I'm also affiliated with the policy school here. And I have a half-time appointment working with the Cornell Atkinson Center, which is entirely focused on interdisciplinary work. So I've kind of transitioned fully over the course of those years. I threw on a few examples of the kinds of policy engagement stuff I'm involved with and have become increasingly involved with. And this is just to sort of show you the kinds of things that if you go this route, you will have the opportunity to do. These are really fascinating, fun things, and I strongly urge you to pursue some of those later in your career if these are things that are of interest. I describe myself as an environmental economist, although sometimes I call myself an agricultural economist, depending on who what the audience is. And that's just the list of sort of topics. So let me get into to the three projects that I thought I would talk you through to kind of tell you how this all started. So there's a project called the Iowa Lakes Valuation Project. Let me see what I have on my screen. This was started, move that thing, in the early 2000s. I had, by that time, become a full professor, so I felt very comfortable trying new things, taking risks a little bit. And I had started working very much with an environmental economist and econometrician, Joe Harrigus. And we started cooking up ideas of what kinds of really innovative, we hoped, new data sets we could develop. So we put in a proposal to the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to do a household-based study of the lakes in Iowa. So that we could collect data to estimate demand for lake recreation. We got this funding, and once we had 1 year of funding, we thought, wow, let's see if we can make a panel data set. This would be the first time ever. So we applied for EPA funding building on that. It was an interesting research area because we were interested in looking at the value, consumer surplus of water quality changes. And these this was a period of time when there was a lot of change. Well, we're economists, right? So we don't know anything about water quality. So we sought out John Downing, who was a limnologist at Iowa State at the time. And he turns out to have had all this data that they were collecting on these lakes. And so it became very natural to combine efforts. And this was the first really interdisciplinary work I did at any kind of scale. John is as I said, a limnologist and an ecologist. He's also somebody who was keenly curious and welcoming to talk to economists. And that's very important in developing a team, because it turns out that some people are really good at adapting and thinking about other people's way of looking at the world. Others really aren't that interested. And to some extent, you kind of have to figure out who there is. So in this case, one of the things that really got us going was the need for data. We went to John, he had the data. But then when we started talking to him, we realized, wow, there's more things that can be learned from actually working together and not just sort of, hey, give us your data. This resulted in a series of surveys, and this was just, you don't really need this information, but we collected a series of data beginning in the early 2000s. As we worked and developed, we built more linkages across the state. People in the Department of Natural Resources in the state government became very interested. We were able to work and engage with them. So this was a very strong link to sort of a policy outreach engagement with state government that I turned out to really enjoy. Feeling like the work we were doing was not just landing in journals, and it was really important it land in journals. We needed and wanted to constantly be publishing in disciplinary and interdisciplinary outlets. But this was a project that really showed me you can do things that are both really good quality research, at least I hope it was, and really of value to states and so on. So yeah, that's stuff you don't need to go. Bottom line of this work, you now see the covers of the entire series of lake surveys that have been done. The first 4, you see they're in kind of reverse chronological order here, 2002, 3, 4, and 5, were funded both by the state and the US EPA in a grant. By doing that, we built a network within the state and of researchers, and we're able then every about 5 years to ask for funding to do the same survey again to create this really long run household panel. I'm not even involved in it anymore. The last one I had any involvement with was 2014, and that mostly I didn't lead, but is now continuing. There was a 2019 survey done. So this is sort of what evolved out of this very early work with John Downing. I want to segue now to a second example. This is work in water quality, and I've titled this Integrated Agricultural Water Quality Modeling. The IAM there is Integrated Assessment Model, doesn't matter jargon. The idea here in environmental economics, there's been a lot of work, or was a lot of work, looking at air quality and the way that air emissions enter the atmosphere, move with wind currents and conditions, and then end up dispersing to populations elsewhere. This kind of work also is very much true of how pollutants move through land and agricultural landscapes. And so a number of people, not just us, actually Ben Gramig has done some work in this area too, But a number of us began working to model how decisions on agricultural land uses, about whether the land was in production, how it was cropped, how much fertilizer was applied, and so on, how those decisions impacted water quality downstream in other locations. So we did some of this work, and I got the idea that at this time, there was a lot of new, at least it was new to me, understanding of this very large hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think that many people now have heard the terms hypoxic zone, either for the Gulf or elsewhere. At the time we started this work, it was only relatively new on the radar of the general public, I would say. So this was sort of late 2000s. I'd heard about it and had a chance to meet Nancy Rabelais, who has been the lead scientist in documenting the size of the hypoxic zone. Long story short, there was a call from NSF that came out called Coupled Natural Human Systems. And I thought, oh, let's give this a swing. But in order to give it a swing, I had to stand back and say, well, how the heck are we going to do this? I can do the economics thinking here. The economics part conceptually is really quite simple. How do we think about designing policy to minimize costs to achieve improvements in the hypoxic zone? Okay, basic economic question. But to do that, I realized, wow, we have to have a model that can do this sort of land use modeling. And we have to have a model that measures the size of the hypoxic zone in response. So I looked around and went to EPA, USDA folks, not EPA, USDA, NRCS folks who were doing large scale land use modeling. And this was a group based in Texas, got them on board. And then I called up Nancy Rabelais and said, hey, want to join us? We need a brilliant oceanographer to sell this to NSF. And happily she was. And so we wrote a proposal and it got funded. This is really a ugly picture. I'm not going to really try to tell you, but I like that. Basically what we did with a whole lot of work and a whole lot of integration with hydrologists, land use, and Nancy's work is to develop this Pareto function. So on the left, you see the total costs, and along the horizontal axis, you see the size predicted in our modeling of the hypoxic zone. So it just shows you a trade-off frontier between how much you'd have to spend to achieve given reductions in the hypoxic zone. Very simple economics concept, but no way could this be done by economists, or at least it couldn't be done well, in my opinion. And so that was kind of the outcome of quite a bit of work. It was fascinating. I learned a ton about water quality, hypoxia, and so on. Final example I'm going to give you is one I'm working on now. This is being done also with ecologists, but a different type of ecologists. This is a project on valuing water quality. Christy Dolph and Jacques Finley, who are the first two names listed there, are ecosystem ecologists who work on rivers and streams, freshwater, rivers and streams, in particularly in the Midwest, but also around the country. We teamed up with them. The other folks that you see listed there are all economists. We teamed up with them to apply for grant funding from EPA, who was looking for people to estimate the value of water quality improvements at local rivers and streams and with a goal of incorporating the biological integrity, health of those streams in a more inclusive way than just recreation use. So in reading the call, it became very clear we needed ecologists, limnologists who would understand that. So in this case, we wanted to do the economics, and we realized right away we couldn't do good economics here without a careful integration with the ecology. So that's the story about how this one came about. And these are the research questions, which I think I just basically said. The first one I'll repeat. How can we depict variations in water quality and their effects on ecosystems in ways that are understandable to lay audiences, but still ecologically appropriate? To answer that, we worked very closely with Jacques and Christy, with graphics designers. We did a bunch of focus groups and ended up with a variety of depictions, including these that show sort of cartoon figures associated with relatively healthy ecosystems, the biodiversity on the left, and relatively unhealthy, degraded ecosystems with the associated biological integrity. Maps of how we did the willingness to pay elicitation. Again, this is just to give you a flavor of what we did and why it was so important to have the ecologists. We simply could not have done this. Those maps you're seeing on the right were entirely developed by the ecologists team based on collected data on ecological integrity that we didn't know about and would not have had access to without them. And that's just results. I won't bore you with that. And that's the end of my talk. So I hope that that teed up some useful stories as we go forward, and hope I didn't go too far over time.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathy. That was a very insightful presentation. I already had a bunch of questions. Probably I will ask later, but for the audience, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box. Even during the presentation, you don't have to hold it until the last minute. So the earlier you put it there, maybe that will make our presenters thought more about it. And sometimes you may find, oh, the later presenters may address part of that question, and that will help you to evolve the question as well. Then our second speaker is Alex, and Alex is at the NASA. So we had another NASA speaker for our first workshop as well. And Alex is the climate team leader for the AgMap. It's also short for Agriculture Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. So he has been leading this interdisciplinary and international project to connect climate science and some other physical disciplinary scientists. And I knew Alex also from, so Alex is a very active member of our GLASSNET. So we invited him earlier this year to speak at our GLASSNET conference. And I asked him to comment on our second aspect of the workshop, which is the removal of the techno barrier, because I think he has extensive experience in handling all those skills, and you need to conduct interdisciplinary research. Alex, so I hope to hear more about that from you.
All right, thanks. I'm going to share my screen and we're off. Good. So thanks for having me here. It's great to continue the conversations with GLASSNET and to pull more people in. There's a lot of interesting work, and I'm going to focus on this idea of technical barriers to research collaboration across disciplinary and geographic borders. And you'll see that a lot of what I'll do is talk about how this AgMap project has tried to build community efforts to take on some of these big challenges. So you'll see more about that from me. I'm going to repeat again this acronym you're going to hear me mention a lot, so I'll get it out of the way. AgMIP is the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, and you'll hear all about it in a minute. So within AgMIP, I'm the science coordinator and the climate team leader, which means I kind of play a role in many of the aspects of AgMIP. But before we get into all that, I want to give a quick personal story in terms of how I see my career getting more and more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, or convergent, you know, in terms of the research that I've been doing. And I like to describe it as a long effort chasing relevance. And maybe that's a little bit selfish or self-deprecating, but when I first started, I was an atmospheric sciences major actually at Cornell University. And that's where you learn all about atmospheric physics and chemistry and a very theoretical and technical approach. And many of my colleagues became weathermen and weather ladies on TV, for example. But I actually followed a slightly different path. I wanted to model atmospheres of different planets. So I was doing planetary atmospheres, modeling the atmosphere of Jupiter. Really, really fascinating stuff, but I realized that it was very far away, literally, and very difficult to get even one measurement of what we were looking at. And it became a little bit too esoteric for me, and I wanted to bring something a little bit closer to home. So I pursued a PhD in climate change at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography out in San Diego. And there I studied the water cycle because I think everybody knows what a flood and a drought is like. So this felt much more tangible. But even then, it was somewhat theoretical. We were writing models and presenting the models to other people writing models, and I felt like it was a little bit of an insular circle of professional kind of development. So I started getting involved in climate policy and interdisciplinary approaches. We invited people from the law school, from the engineering school, from the business school to come and talk about climate. And this would have been in the early 2000s, and we were talking about the great potential of solar panels and different types of approaches in terms of getting businesses involved in sustainability. And a lot of those things have really played out even in that short time frame since back then. So it's really been fascinating to see how those early discussions have evolved. But this is now getting closer and closer towards people's lives. So when I finished my PhD, I told my advisor that I wanted to go into this area. And I had several people who were kind of theoretical climate change people, basically more in the fact that I was leaving the sciences by going into interdisciplinary research, which was not at all true. There's a lot of research to be done at the interface of theoretical climate change and what it means to people. So I did my postdoc here at NASA GISS. NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies is located in New York City. And I was very fortunate to get a postdoctoral advisor who is world famous on the aspects of climate and agriculture. I'll say more about her in a minute. But pursuing climate impacts on agriculture quickly became, again, a chasing of relevance. So at first I was thinking, how does climate affect yield? How does climate change the amount of wheat you might get from a single acre of farmland, for example? But I realized that even farmers don't care so much about yield. They care about production and net income. So how much money can they make by producing on their whole farm? So not just one field, but all of the farms together and the overall amount of expenses and incomes that they can get. But even then, that's not enough. We have to think about food systems. So where does the food go after it leaves the farm gate? How is it processed and traded and consumed and marketed all around the world? That gets to questions of nutrition. That gets to questions of food security and the overall outcomes of food insecurity, which includes things like socioeconomic and geopolitical stability or instability. So you can see that what started from very theoretical atmospheric sciences has now moved into a place where I have to be talking to farmers. I have to be talking to nutrition experts and health people. I have to be thinking about trade, so economics, and even now getting into policy and geopolitics. So I've found that the thing that kind of pulls all of this together is to focus on specific decision processes and to ask the question of what type of climate information, going all the way back up to the upper part of this chart, what type of climate information is needed to make all of the decisions down this long line, because that drought is still causing impacts all the way through this chain, even all the way to geopolitical stability. And we can track that and inform that. So to bring it back to AgMIP, AgMIP was formed in recognition that there is a huge challenge or set of challenges for the agricultural sector. The world is asking agricultural experts to sustainably increase production to provide healthy food for growing and developing populations around the world, while at the same time adapting to climate change and ongoing climate extremes, while also mitigating emissions from agricultural lands, which is somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas challenge in terms of emissions. But all of this has to be done in a way that maintains the financial incentives for agriculture, or else nobody will do it. So any one of these challenges is substantial, but when you put them all happening at the same time, that's why this is such a difficult and sticky challenge. So AgMIP was formed to say, okay, well, what tools could we use to start to pull these pieces apart and understand the specific decision processes that will help us meet all of these challenges? And one of the things that's appealing about models is that they allow us to go beyond the observed experience and ask what if questions, like what if we had a different type of seed, or what if our markets were designed in a different way, or what if there was a policy that provided an incentive or a penalty for certain types of actions. So the fundamental approach for AgMIP is to stack multiple models together. So we want multiple crop and livestock models to be able to run the same problems so that we can benefit from having a multi-model approach and learning from each other. And before AgMIP, this community was in many ways acting independently. So we tried to stack the models and encourage people to talk, and then build this fundamental connection between crop and livestock models and the agricultural economic models, which we also were stacking up, considering there are multiple over there. This required us to learn new language. We had to figure out how to talk to each other and say what are the assumptions that we're making in one model or the requirements of another model, and can we make those two things come together? So this took years, and we launched back in 2010 to provide this community for systematic improvement and application of a multidisciplinary, multi-model, and multi-scale framework for agricultural development and food security. And it started with this connection and the conversation we had there. Eventually, this has started to blur together because more and more of the models include both or all of the physical, biophysical, and socioeconomic sides. This is part of the goals also of GLASSNET, is to start to merge networks and build stronger connections between these disciplines. But once we had this stack of agricultural models, now we can do some really interesting things. We can take our historical data and policy and run them through our agricultural models so we can evaluate and intercompare across the models, but also learn from that to improve our calibrations and the models themselves. Once we're comfortable with the models and their performance in the historical period, we run future information through. So future climate change, shifts in policy or technology, and we run that through agricultural models to tell us about future of agricultural production and trade and food security, as well as specific actions we can take around adaptation, mitigation, and extensions to things like water resources or urban impacts. So that fundamental diagram I just showed you is the basis of AgMIP, and AgMIP has grown from a meeting of about 70 people in 2010. I'm trying to remember if Tom Hurdle was there. He may be in one of these spaces, but certainly early on, we've been working with GTAP and the group at Purdue. And the meetings basically grew by 50% every year until I don't even have the most recent ones. But we are now planning our 9th AgMIP Global Workshop, and all of these folks are building this community together. What we're doing with these models is centered around 3 main pillars of application. First and foremost, we're trying to make better knowledge and better data and tools and models themselves. We're also modeling the sustainability of farming systems, and we are doing coordinated global and regional assessments to actually apply the models around the big challenges of the world, and that is across scales. I apologize, I think there's some noise coming from my window here. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. So as I mentioned, this is my advisor, Cynthia Rosenzweig. We are now the co-directors of the Climate Impacts Group at NASA GISS. And Cynthia was just awarded the World Food Prize in 2022, which is often called the Nobel Prize for Food. And you can see that the food prize was specifically calling out her work on AgMIP and how we have used this work to support decision processes all around the world. So within our models, what we're fundamentally doing is trying to capture the response of agricultural systems to various hazards and disasters. So we want to understand temperature response from very cold to very hot, rainfall and precipitation responses from dry to wet, and other things like extreme storms, pests and diseases, and air pollution. And around these fundamental responses, plus many more that we're trying to constantly add, we can monitor what's happening in the field today, and we can forecast what might happen at the end of this season, or maybe even one season out into the future. This is going to be a timeline I'm building down here. With that information, we can react to what we're seeing in the field and provide, potential alternative solutions on this real-time basis. We can also use the same models to go back in time and detect and attribute impacts in the past and ask questions like, what if we had planted a different date or used a different seed? Could we have a counterfactual management that gives us a better outcome? This helps us understand the past and also gives us ideas of how we might address future challenges. If we go far enough in the future, it's really no longer a forecast. It is a scenario-based projection contingent on a certain set of outcomes playing out into the future. And this is where we talk about climate change or market influences or shifts in policy and socioeconomics and overall environmental sustainability. And this is really important because it allows us to be proactive in our interventions, to think not just about responding to disasters as they occur, but getting ready for them before they hit us too hard. So this approach has now built AgMIP into a community of more than 1,200 experts around the world, and we have more than 50 protocol-based activities. And my job as science coordinator is to track all of these, and whenever possible, figure out how to link them together and pass best practices from one to the next. I don't have enough time to go into all of this, but I'd encourage you to check out agmip.org if you want to learn more or get involved. Within AgMIP, we're working on process improvement using field experiments, and we're doing intercomparisons of specific crop species models, like our wheat team, which currently has more than 40 wheat models being intercompared. And just to give you an idea of this, this is our cartoon of what might happen in a given field. The field has, weather that's influencing it with rainfall. We have satellites and drones potentially giving us information from a distance. But what we really want to understand is what's happening in this plant and how is it being affected by irrigation and water resources? What are the exchanges of greenhouse gases? What are the roles of pests and diseases and weeds? How do the farmers themselves influence it? And also the use of equipment or air pollution and groundwater and all these different aspects of the field we are trying to improve our models upon. We're also taking our crop models and running them all around the world so that we can build up these global applications. And here's just an example of our projections. In this case, using 12 different crop models and 5 climate models in this ensemble stack. And what you see here is that the maize or corn yield all around the world is generally turning more red, which means a decrease in yield and production as we're going out into the future under this high emissions scenario. The wheat picture is much more complicated, with some areas improving given the carbon dioxide benefits, but other areas having decreases, especially in tropical areas and warm wheat growing areas like Pakistan and Mexico in the southern United States. So here we see really big differences between crop species and also between region, and we want to understand and get ready for these challenges. The other thing we're doing is regional integrated assessments and global integrated assessments, including some of the global economic models that Dominique van de Mensbrugge and others are running. And here we combine all of that information into the big picture assessment. So we take those global crop models results and we feed them into economic models to understand shifts in trade dynamics and overall prices of different commodities. On a regional, or to do this, maybe a better way of saying it is it really underscores why we need both multiple scales and multiple disciplines. So we use these models to address a lot of different challenges, but it's easiest to understand through a story, which is what happens on one field in terms of production is just one example of what is happening all around the world. And we can model one field, and we can model fields all around the world to understand global crop production. That output then feeds into our global market models, so we can set prices, which in turn affect what happens in regional markets, setting the prices, which in turn might dictate what a farmer would do the following year. So we are building models in each of these four corners and figuring out how to link them so that we can understand biophysical and economic approaches, regional and global scales, and ask these big questions that I've already mentioned in the past. Let's see. All right, so the other thing we're trying to understand is the storylines of future agricultural systems, and these are very much interdisciplinary. So what we're trying to understand is when we go to a regional integrated assessment, when we're working in India or Zimbabwe or Senegal, the first thing we do is we engage the stakeholders and assess the climate risks. So we want to know what happened in your field or in your region in the past that made you concerned about climate. Was there a flood or a drought or a heat wave? Then we work with those stakeholders to co-design pathways to ask questions about what the agricultural systems will look like in the future in that region. This leads to what we call representative agricultural pathways, which are scenarios of that future development. Then we think about adaptation packages, so we can redesign farm systems in preparation for these changes, and we evaluate the impact using our models. And this becomes an iterative process with sustained stakeholder engagement so that we can develop future systems that are ready for these changes that are coming. Final thing I'll mention here is the tools and technology. One of the most exciting things about the AgMIP approach is that we are making models that are able to take on some of the high data requirements of agricultural systems. We have satellite information down at very fine resolutions. Farmers themselves are collecting information on their tractors, their combines, so that they know information even down to a field level. And we are building from the ground up models that are able to take that type of information in. And here's just an example in the state of Iowa. We're going to zoom in and start ticking through various historical years. These are crop model simulations run at 30-meter resolution. And in yellow, you see corn, and in green is soy. The brighter colors indicate that you have higher yield, and the darker colors are bad yield. And in a moment, you'll see the 2012 drought where everything is going to go dark, at least on my screen happening there. And this is information that we can use to build in more approaches to assimilate data and provide information on how farmers can get the best out of their fields, and even the high and low producing regions in their fields, as you can see here. So the final thing I'll just mention is that we have been establishing this framework for agricultural models that is benefiting from central collaboration to curate historical input data sets, to build configuration information that we have some expert judgment saying that this configuration is viable for the systems that are being modeled. We are building up translators and systems capable of running multiple models, providing common input and output formats, and setting the stage for expanded data assimilation. We're also really excited about the fact that we have huge sets of model outputs that are really ripe for machine learning applications and ways of combining model output across different projects. And as we're building this, we see lots of entry points for people to come in and improve one or parts of any of these systems. And we can use these models to go back in time and understand the past, do near or real-time, monitoring and seasonal forecasting, and then provide specific information into decisions made around present-day risk management, adaptation and mitigation, as well as those challenges as we go further out into the future. And these models, as I've mentioned, are useful not only for producing agricultural outcomes, but connections to water, energy, land, and carbon resource management. And these bottom three things here are what we really think about when we're talking about climate smart food systems and agro ecosystems. And that's what we're really trying to support. So thanks again. And I'm really excited to interact with early career researchers because there's a lot of growth potential in AgMIP and connections into GLASSNET that are very strong here. So I'm hoping I can stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Great. That's a very it's an excellent talk, Alex. I'm so glad that Alex accepted our invitation and willing to present this, because AgMIP is such a perfect example for this interdisciplinary research. And I believe a lot of you have, I like the storyline specifically very much. I think it's very practical, and it's exactly what we need when we start interdisciplinary research. Yeah, so thank you very much for that. And for the audience, if you want to revisit the video or share it with someone, so Holly has recorded, we'll share the link for a recording after the event. And then hopefully you can find more information from it or share it with others. So I saw there were already some questions for our speakers, for Alex, for and Kathy already, and keep feeding them more questions during the presentation. And so now let's move to our last speaker. So last but not least, Ben Gramig. So I knew Ben when he was a professor at Purdue agricultural economics, when I was still a PhD student. So I remember he was very successful at a U2U project that was funded. It's U2U for useful to usable, and it was a large interdisciplinary group, but very successful and very with a lot of impacts in this area. And so we're very happy to have Ben today to talk about his experience of leading and managing those interdisciplinary groups, and so which we found probably some challenges because it's so diverse with people from different backgrounds, and hope to learn some useful tips from Ben. Ben.
Thanks, Jing.
Mm-hmm.
Great to be here. Yeah, the topic I focused on, I think fits nicely with the other two speakers in the sense of kind of what we each maybe focused in on. I sort of tackled that third one a little bit more, so I'm not going to spend quite as much time maybe telling you war stories or whatever you want to think of those as from my time in the trenches, but I'm going to try and provide maybe some more high-level sort of thoughts about leading teams, working in those teams, how teams can be effective, hopefully, just based on my own experiences. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that I haven't usually been the overall leader of most of these big teams and efforts that I've been on. I've played different roles. I always have been part of the sort of leadership team or committee, kind of, overseeing big teams, and I've had responsibilities for sort of subsets of the group, but very much have been directly engaged in a lot of work across disciplines, across teams, sub-objectives, things like that. So that's what's going to inform what I'm talking about today. Maybe the title here is a little overly adventurous or ambitious, but this is a little bit about sort of my experience to date. And I did include one slide here, sort of give you a sense of my timeline. Jing mentioned where she first sort of came to know me. Before I started on the academic path and ended up where I am right now, I think this very much informs my interest in an approach to research that is interdisciplinary, that works across disciplines, that has included a lot of engagement with outreach, as well as just sort of across disciplines. So the general public, decision makers, those kinds of things. Out of my undergraduate, I worked in the state government role in an agricultural policy focused position with tobacco farmers in Kentucky. I'm from Kentucky, who were diversifying away from tobacco and getting into other crops. This is where I really started to work on agriculture because I'm a city kid. I'm not from a farm or anything like that, and started doing some sort of ag and environment risk work with Jerry Skis, who some of you may know, who's a faculty member there and has done a lot of more recently international development focused risk management work. But that led me back to, it's what got me interested in economics. I am an economist, so I went back, did a master's, did a PhD at Michigan State, and then I ended up at Purdue to start my sort of professional career there. That is where I met Jing and Tom and others, and really started on this sort of path, I guess. You know, things have changed a lot, I think, over time, and they're continuing to change in terms of rewards for interdisciplinarity. You know, there's probably like a one academic generation gap maybe between Kathy and I. I think she said she was starting, or she was in the early 2000s. She was a full professor, and she started to really venture out into this space when she was sort of telling her story. You can see, you know, 8 or so years after that was when I was starting, and I dove right into this and was actually hired with an explicit sort of mandate. You need to engage with people in these interdisciplinary centers. You need to get grants and do these things. That doesn't mean that the rewards or the evaluation were always quite up to speed, even though there was prioritizing for this. But I always had a really good experience with it at Purdue. I was then at University of Illinois. This should say Illinois, not Purdue, 2017 to 2021. Screwed up my own timeline, copying and pasting. I was at Illinois for 4 years, and then I've just been about a little bit more than a year at USDA as a research economist. So basically, I've continued to do my own research program that I had before, which is very sort of ag and conservation and production and environment oriented. I don't teach classes anymore. I am still advising a number of graduate students, one of whom's on the job market right now. But the common sort of elements across, I think, this timeline that really sort of have informed, again, my sort of interdisciplinary focus has been a really heavy focus on institutions and thinking about how institutions work. I use that term very broadly to mean markets, policies, stakeholder groups, interest groups, ag production organizations, those kinds of things, thinking about how they're all engaged and influence what's happening on the landscape. I worked very early on in some of that consulting work and in my master's degree with ag meteorology folks and engineers, and really found that to be valuable and fun and interesting. And I wanted to keep doing that kind of stuff. Also, focus very much around sort of the things people care about the most, the things that drive the choices that they make, the way they manage their farmland, the way that they decide what to purchase, how to purchase, those kinds of things, right? All those things are really tied very much back to basic physical science, in addition to the social science that I studied. So anyway, you know, all these connections are there, right? I see the whole picture, and so it's always been something that's interesting to me. I've worked in lots of different teams, right? You can think of a lab. This is the economist lab. Okay, if you're in another discipline, we tend to have smaller labs. Well, Kathy and Tom, maybe not. Maybe they have 12 and 15 people, but I never have more than 4 or 5 people. That's about the max for what I could manage. Right. This is Thanksgiving 2019. These are just budding economists, a postdoc and 3 graduate students and their families. Right. I work on teams of social scientists. This is a writing team basically. So I'm the only economist in the picture, but you've got a rural sociologist, you've got a planner, you have a sort of more environmental sociologist, you know, you've got a number of different people. We're on a writing retreat before a conference, working on a proposal, working on a final draft of a paper, doing some other things for the week before the Soil and Water Conservation Society meeting at an Airbnb outside of Pittsburgh here. Here's an early picture from Purdue, maybe some faces that Purdue folks will recognize. You might even be able to pick me out. I don't know. That was a long time ago. But this is a, you know, within institution interdisciplinary teams. So this is just a Purdue, you know, one institution, but we've got engineers, we have agronomists, we have an economist, we have physicist here, a climate physics person, right? There's a lot of people with a lot of different expertise coming together. And of course, there's graduate students and there's postdocs and all the things we need to make teams work. Or those bigger teams. You saw some pictures from some of the big teams folks have worked on. Jing mentioned the Useful to Usable project. This is a picture of that team. And right, you've got many people across many disciplines and many sectors, people that are doing, you know, in the private sector, as well as academics, as well as outreach and engagement. So, you know, all of these things and these kinds of experiences are are what certainly have informed me. Again, I'm going to offer some high level stuff after a few stories, just to sort of give you a sense of kind of what has probably informed what I think and how I've, I guess, evolved as a researcher myself. In terms of research ideas, you know, this may not sound very sage, but obviously you got to talk things over, but there's a lot of refinement, right? And throwing things up against the wall, and do they stick or they just fall to the floor? You know, what has legs? Wait, I need to go look up a few papers. Did anybody ever actually publish anything on this, right? And there's just a lot of repetition and repeating as you're starting to hammer things out. Personally, I've always found that in-person meetings are just incredible. Yes, we live in a post-COVID world where we're going about things in different ways, and we found much more, I think, effective and productive ways to sort of replicate some of the old school ways that we used to do these things. But personally, and maybe I'm just a little old school, you know, I still like to get together, get the whiteboard out, have one-on-one conversations, break up into small groups, rotate, mix. This isn't just great for research idea development and, you know, figuring out a proposal and key research questions. This is really, really important, I think, for team cohesiveness and building a team if you're starting out and writing proposals and trying to figure out, you know, what do we all bring to the table? How does something I'm doing, is it a value to someone else's discipline or contributions to a project, and vice versa? So a lot of those kind of conversations are really valuable in that way. I think key things that need to be talked about early on that are really helpful and can help ensure success, but also make sure you're not, you know, there's not elephants in the room that are hiding behind a lamp in the corner that you can't see for some reason, is, you know, understanding and talking about data needs. There's a lot of talk about that with modeling and other things with some of the other talks. You know, how are there similarities or where are there differences? Who has distinct data versus data that can be collected maybe through the same survey instrument, or how could field measurements be an input to modeling work, and all of those kinds of pieces, right? Where are the feedbacks that happen not just across disciplines, but across individual models if there's multiple kinds of modeling going on? And where are there feedbacks between the outreach and public engagement components, if those are components of your project, right? It may be more of a pure research focus. Where are the linkages there back to the research? Does engagement with an audience, a stakeholder audience, actually help inform the science? Can it actually create one of the hypotheses or help define the modeling scenarios that you're going to use or consider when you're doing global or local or watershed or whatever the scale of your work is, modeling, right? How do these feedbacks happen between these different components in the research process, the different disciplines, the different maybe sub objectives on your proposal, right? Sometimes we have things that sort of happen in parallel but don't ever really intersect. There's probably some things that are kind of more orthogonal to one another and maybe don't even seem like they're necessarily related, especially if there are some really core disciplinary components to that larger project. Perhaps most important would be sequentiality, right? Are there things that have to happen in year 1 and 2 that collect data that are inputs to policy and economics and other kinds of things, or outreach components later in these big projects, which is, I think, often the case. A key thing to also keep in mind, of course, is the tension that always does exist between disciplinary science and the interdisciplinary that you're engaged in, right? Which things are your core disciplinary pieces, research questions, contributions that you're going to be able to make, hopefully, to the literature once you've collected that data, done that experiment, estimated that model, whatever it is, and which ones are really more interdisciplinary or policymaker targeted or whatever it might be. I think these are all really important things to talk about as early as possible and start kicking around, even if they're not entirely hammered out. Air some of these issues, get them out there, start talking about them as you're working on things. I've got a couple pros and some sort of cons. I think one of the biggest advantages, and maybe this isn't a sales job because the people involved in GLASSNET obviously are doing interdisciplinary work, but I think a huge advantage to doing interdisciplinary work is that I think you have probably a larger opportunity to have an impact on not just, some of us are interested in impacting decisions that are made on the ground, helping inform people make better decisions, helping inform policy. But I think Also, the opportunity to have a greater impact on other academic and research communities. There's a I think there's a higher probability that people in other disciplines will read your economic research, your climate science research, when you publish in more of these interdisciplinary kind of outlets, and write in a way that is more broadly accessible, probably, than the really, really formal technical jargon of our own disciplines. And I think that can really expand the reach of your work and the impact. It's always helpful to step outside of our own little academic silos, right? Take the blinders off and sort of step back and see what's going on. It's just like it's great to go out and talk to somebody who's actually using a technology or making a decision that you're interested in informing or improving on the ground, like a farmer or something like that. It's really helpful, I think, to step back and look at what are the big questions in this other discipline that intersects with right, a technical issue or something like that, that intersects with a more social science focused issue or barrier that you're thinking about when you're thinking about designing a policy or evaluating different levers that can be used. It's fun. It's interesting. It is for me anyway. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. So hopefully people enjoy it. Most of us are lifelong learners if we're in the more academic track, or we're PhDs. So I think that's a good thing. Grow your professional network. You're going to get to know people, even if they're on some other objective way across a project that you don't interact with, but you just see them kind of in a social setting at the annual team meeting or something like that. You're going to get to know that person. And when they get a tenure track job at some other university, you can say, oh, I know him, and you should go talk to him and get him on a proposal, because he can do some really good social science work when you're doing your work on aquifer recharge or whatever it is that you're doing in your area. Cons, again, if you can call them that, it's really hard to do interdisciplinary work well. I think it's really hard to try to do a one-off kind of paper or journal article, right? That's especially difficult. That said, that can be the impetus, right, for building a team. It can form a springboard for a bigger and more sustained sort of collaboration. So I think it's hard. It's not easy to do this, to put these pieces together. I mentioned before that this hasn't always historically been rewarded. This has changed a lot. That issue of disciplinary contributions plus interdisciplinary contributions is a huge one that still has to be looked at very closely by junior academics, especially, I think, that are on the tenure track. We need to think about this as well. There's lots of ways that disciplines differ, and you don't know what they are until you start to talk with each other or start to talk about things that are going on. So different disciplinary norms, that can be something as silly or something as whose name goes first on a publication or last if you're the lead. Is equal senior authorship the standard in a particular area? Those things matter, and they're important. So they're things to talk about when you start doing that work, whether it's as part of a big sustained team, or maybe it's just a deliverable or a committee that you're working on or something like that. This is also really important when you talk about graduate students and think about mentoring those junior students. How does co-authorship work with them? Is their sole authorship really important for things that come out of their thesis or their dissertation? Those are important things to think about and appreciate. People have already mentioned this, right? We all use different jargon. So you got to learn the language of the people that you're working with. It's infuriating when you spend an hour going back and forth debating with somebody, and then you're like, oh, we're just using two terms for the same exact thing, right? we call something or some phenomenon, or I don't know, I'm thinking about like a steady state or something like that you talk about, like, oh, that's what you mean when you say steady state? I mean equilibrium, or whatever it is. Just some little jargony kind of thing. So there's a need to learn other people's languages and then take those things into account. In terms of leading effectively, I think that was one of the things on the outline they sent. Engaging very early is important, at the proposal stage if possible, right? This really can set the stage for a successful team, or a team that's ready to run once they get that email. Then everyone goes, oh my gosh, we got the money. What do we do now? Everybody's hopefully gotten to have that experience at least once. This can really set the stage for being ready to hit the ground running when that happens. I think that agreements and guidelines about how your team is going to handle co-authorship are very important. Some sort of a document that captures that. There's lots of good examples that are out there if you haven't seen something like this before. Doing intra-team evaluation along the process, I think, is really important. Any team, of course, could benefit from that, but interdisciplinary teams in particular, I think it's easy for groups or individuals to potentially become isolated or feel like their ideas are not getting into the survey instrument, or they're not integrating into the project because different people have different ways of interacting, or there's always strong voices and personalities and things like that can take over. And so if you're doing continuous intra-team evaluation about internal functioning, you can try to cut those things off and make sure that connections are made and things like that. And then there's more nuts and bolts stuff. I just have this as a bullet point, but Alex, I think, just talked about this a bunch, right? Data, file formats, file sharing, messaging, communications, data storage, right? Nobody enjoys it, but you got to have like some sort of Slack versus Teams versus listserv debate or something early on. How are we going to communicate? Are we going to use Dropbox or Box or some other proprietary solution, right? All those things just are part of figuring it out and then making it work. Okay, that's the end. This concludes Ben's notes about interdisciplinarity. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. I think you have had too many experience and very difficult to fit it all in 15 minutes presentation. Sorry for the challenge, but you did a great job. Yeah, we were very impressed by those images you posted. I saw many people I knew. Okay, we already have a lot of excellent questions in the chat box, so I would like to start them at the beginning and then give a chance to the people who ask the question to elaborate and then maybe interact with our speakers. I know some of the questions are particularly for one of the speakers, but the other speakers feel free to comment on that if you have your own opinions about what the questions ask. And the first one I saw from Danielle for Kathy. Danielle, do you want to speak for that?
Sure, thanks. I was asking Kathy, and she already somewhat answered in the chat, but I'll make sure everyone has a chance to hear. Was I asking? It's been a while. Hold on. What did I ask? Oh, I think I was asking about publications. How do you publish both in your disciplinary journals and in good journals, but also you had this public-facing material and we're doing policy work. Like, how do you keep both of those sort of publishing streams going? And like, what were the challenges if there were any?
That's it's such a good question. I think I always, especially in the early part of my career until I was a full professor, I always came at things as an economist. And so I was always thinking about, well, I still always come as things as an economist. That's not a good way to frame it, but I was still thinking always about publishing in the kinds of journals that I was used to publishing in. And that continued to be sort of what I want to do. But I would, with all the work on Iowa Lakes, there was really not a big trade-off. There's always trade-off because there's always time. But to engage with the limnologist, that gave us the data we needed. It gave us the content and context for measuring water quality that we needed. So at the time, I wouldn't have felt it was much of a trade-off. Although clearly doing the work we did on the outreach side, working with the Department of Natural Resources and so on. And for that one, I'm going to pull a comment that Alex said. At that point in my career, I was very much seeking relevance. And I could see that the kind of work we were doing and publishing in journals was really relevant if I could communicate it and alter it a little bit. I had to listen to what the state policymakers wanted. At first, I just tried to jam down their into their heads, you should only be paying attention to consumer surplus. You should only be thinking about these welfare measures. Stop talking about jobs and economic impact. And that didn't fully convince them. And after a while, I realized I'm being far too narrow in my own thinking. They do care about those things, and there's a role for those. And so this is not really answering your question, but it's sort of part of I realized I need to be more open to what they want and what they need. Particularly if I'm going to make any headway in convincing them that things like economic welfare should drive state decision-making, in addition to a variety of other factors, including things like community engagement, which depends on employment and jobs and so on. So, yeah, I want it to be relevant. And I also had the luxury of a position in an agricultural economics department. Well, it was econ, but I was funded through ag. And I had a course load less than my econ colleagues. And I had the support of my dean and others to do things like that. And that gets to several of the comments and questions that people have talked about, sort of pros and cons of interdisciplinary work. Being in a place that supports and engages and wants you to do this can make a huge difference compared to many, many departments in university homes.
Alex, I see you raised hands.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this also. It's interesting. I think there are a couple of comments I wanted to make here. First is that I have often found that it's okay to kind of be the second author or even the 10th author on papers. You can get a lot of productivity by being part of transdisciplinary teams. Some of that comes from the fact that I sometimes find myself as the best climate scientist in a room full of crop modelers, or the next day I might be the best crop modeler in a room full of climate scientists, right? I might not be the best crop modeler, I might not be the best climate scientist, but there's a huge need for somebody who can speak both languages and be there and be present and aware of what the big challenges are. I usually try to get 1 or 2 first author papers a year, which is pretty low for somebody at a research institution like myself. But I have lots and lots of second author papers. And what I found is my immediate bosses sometimes don't get it, but the 3rd or 4th level bosses, and even at this point, the director, you know, the head of earth sciences at NASA, we just had the administrator come through and a lot of his questions ended up coming my way. The people at the very top really have to think interdisciplinary, you know, in terms of applying things for policy and social benefit. So sometimes you have to find your way up to the higher rungs of the ladder to have people really hear what you're doing and value it. And in that sense, you know, if your immediate supervisor doesn't, don't give up. Look maybe even above and see if they do.
Great. Great suggestions. I hope that answers Daniel's question. And then Tom, you are the next.
Yeah, like Danielle, I can't remember all that I asked along the way, but let me go back to a question for
had a
Kathy.
question for Kathy. Yeah.
Yes, for Kathy. So Kathy, you explicitly said that you didn't embark on true interdisciplinary work until you were full professor. I think Ben commented on that a little bit. He said, well, I came in and got involved at a younger stage. But what is, for all of you, start with Kathy. I think Ben has comments on this, having been both in academia and outside. What is your advice for early career researchers these days? And I guess also Alex, from his perspective, are there costs to getting involved in this too early? What advice do you give to the ECRs?
I personally have a very strong belief that we need to have that to be a good economist, you need to be fully trained as an economist. I think it's very hard. So I'm thinking very much like getting a PhD. I know that many IGERTs and other things have come about to try to find ways to really do interdisciplinary training. And I think those are great works in progress. I'm always worried that people will not have enough economics to really play in the economics game. That may not be true for other disciplines. I don't want to speak for anything else, but I feel like at least I'm always bad at advice. I can tell you what worked for me. So I found it very valuable to have my feet firmly in economics and have that disciplinary cred. My cred, though, was really just in ag and environmental economics. I don't have cred as a theoretical macro thingy. So, but I got cred in the disciplinary piece I wanted. And then that allowed me to comfortably put my name in the middle of a long list of authors and stick my name at the end or anywhere and put students first. I don't have to care about that anymore. And I didn't have to care about it once I got to be a full professor. And I liked that. So for me, that disciplinary grounding gave me cred from which I could branch out. Is there another way to do it? Probably. And so I don't, it worked really well for me. I do think if you're going to be an economist, you better have plenty of training in the tools and techniques. But people like Ben have that, and he right away went into. So that I'm interested to hear Ben and Alex's thoughts.
Alex.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. When I was first trying to get a postdoc in interdisciplinary science, I struggled. I was, the grant applications for postdocs are very disciplinary for the most part. And it was difficult to find one that would allow me to write my own proposal. I went out, I looked for people who had literally written books about the need for more interdisciplinary science. And when I contacted them, their advice to me was, well, you have to become famous in your field, and then you can start doing interdisciplinary work. And that was very discouraging, to be honest. And I was probably pretty close to just going into a traditional postdoc when I finally got word from Cynthia and the NASA postdoc came through. So it was close. But I think, at the time, that advice of become famous and then you can become interdisciplinary was rooted around the idea that you have to get your tenure kind of first, and then you have to be established in your field before you can become transdisciplinary, or whatever the word you want to use is. I think that's changing. I think it's now that bar is lowering from you have to be famous to you have to have tenure at all, or maybe even before that. I think there are a lot of departments that are now hiring people, even on the tenure track jobs, even on the technical research track jobs that have that interdisciplinary focus. I do still think that line is above PhD. However, I think you have to get your disciplinary PhD because that is hard. Those technical, that kind of highest level of technical training is very difficult to pick up on the fly as an interdisciplinary scientist. I have seen people come out of programs that are master's level programs in an interdisciplinary focus. They're very good to have on your team, but they rarely can lead the team. And in that sense, the PhD really is an important credential. But once you get that, I personally, maybe I was lucky, but I also think I think the field is catching up to the luck that I had in terms of, maybe a good postdoctoral program. Getting involved with a postdoctoral advisor who is themselves interdisciplinary is probably the fastest way in.
Great, thank you. And Katie, you have some questions for Alex about how the sharing.
Oh, we need to hear
models
from
are-
Ben on that. We need everyone's called
Very-
out Ben.
Okay.
Ben
Well,
needs to comment.
Yeah, I don't know. Very briefly, I certainly agree with what I heard both from Kathy and Alex about the need for your PhD and its training to be that's your bread and butter, right? That's what you have to fall back on, and that's also the reason, hopefully, why someone picks up the phone or emails you or whatever else to join a team, because they know you have those chops, that cred, that technical expertise, and it's going to be critical, especially when you think about the proposal writing sort of process, right? If you're junior, that you at least have those skills. And when you're very junior, maybe this speaks to one of the questions Tom posed to me later in the thread. You know, I wouldn't look to lead because you're probably too busy trying to get tenure and other things. But to the extent you can collaborate and work with people and be on teams underneath leaders who look the way you hope that maybe, you know, your research portfolio or your career could look in the future, I think is really instructive. Alex mentioned, you know, getting a PhD supervisor, a postdoc advisor, you know, who's in that space doing the kind of things that you think you want to do, has that kind of a profile. That's huge. Otherwise, you're not going to get exposed to those kinds of things and have opportunities to do those kinds of projects. And it starts to grow your network earlier, right? And you start to meet and know some of those interdisciplinary folks. And you know, not all teams that we're on are successful. I could have put some less successful pictures of teams up there, you know, and some of that's leadership, but some of it's just cohesiveness and timing and other sorts of things. Last thing I would say is where you are in the institution that you're at really does matter, right? The nature of your academic department, if you're in an academic role. Kathy spoke to, you know, the severe importance of disciplinary excellence and which journals you publish in and things like that, you know, up especially through tenure and maybe to full professor before branching out. And while that's important everywhere, especially pre-tenure, you know, there may be more openness to a diversity of things at different places. It just depends, and the culture of places is different and changes over time as well in terms of what's going on. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. I think we have then a few questions for Alex. So starting with Kathy, you asked the first one in about openly sharing their modern time. So their home university or employer support their efforts. Yeah.
Yeah, if you'd like, maybe I'll just speed it up. I'll summarize the question and answer if that's okay with Kathy. Yeah, so Kathy was asking about how did we get people to participate in AgMIP? You know, it's one thing for me to say I want to do it, but how did we get 1,200 people to sign on? The thing that was amazing about AgMIP was we had to demonstrate through our leadership and our principles that participating was in everybody's benefit. The very first AgMIP wheat model intercomparison, people did not want to name their models. They just said, this is model 1, this is model 2, and it was randomized, and the people behind the scenes knew which model was which, but they didn't want to share. And the reason for that is people were worried that if my model comes in last, will I lose all my research funding and nobody will want to work with me? And what we actually found is as soon as we started getting intercomparison results, people started saying, well, why is this model different? And it was hard for us to say which was better or worse right off the bat, but we wanted to know why they were different. And that made people very quickly say, well, you know, I'm the outlier and I have a different soil module or I have a different process in my model, and it might be better, it might be worse, but let's talk about it. And very quickly, people realized that it was in their best interest to talk openly. And what we've found across almost all AgMIP intercomparisons is that the ensemble does better than any single model. That means if you take multiple models and average them together, you're getting a better result. So the scientific result is that we need to work together, and that having a diversity of models is actually better than having only a few models under development. So by us being able to show that and articulate it and advertise it, and then build those principles into the way we lead the program, where we have leaders representing different disciplines and models and regions, you know, that was inclusive, and people have seen it now over several years, such that there's a critical mass of goodwill that I think has allowed us to last this long.
Great. And then we have a few more questions for you, particularly Alex, from Tom and Danielle as well. And Danielle asked AgMIP infrastructure. how this has been built over time? How do you find funding?
Yes. So there were a couple of questions around funding side. And yeah, I mean, AgMIP is not centrally funded in the sense that we are not doling out grants to people to participate in AgMIP. For the most part, we work by having a good research agenda and framework by which people can do the jobs that they're already paid to do. So we work with people at universities who are building crop models, and we say, you know, if you work with the other crop modelers, you can probably do this job better. That's the fundamental approach. The institutions tend to be supportive because they see the benefit, and they are asked oftentimes, the institutional leaders, you know, we're investing this much money in the crop model. Do we even know if it's a good one or a bad one? How can we find out, and what can we do with it? And then the other thing that's true is that intercomparison papers tend to be widely cited and tend to kind of give people a strong impression of what's going on, and you'd rather be part of that paper than outside of it. And that once people realized that it was no longer enough to just keep their own corner and stay away from all the other modelers, that brought things in. So we've been building tools, we've been building frameworks, but most of all, I think that the glue that holds us together is that we have a workshop. Our annual workshops become the basic motivation of those workshops is we will meet this year, we will decide what we want to do for next year, then we'll do that work and present it next year. And we often have a reduction compared to other meetings that I attend. We have less plenary and presentations where it's just I get up and tell you about my research and then you do the same. And we have more working sessions. And one of the key things to those working sessions is we will intentionally mix groups together. So as one example of this, we took our regional economists and our global economists and forced them to talk to each other because they weren't before. We took our crop modelers and our global economists and said, we want you to talk about your assumptions about productivity gains in the next 20 to 50 years. Because the economists just assume a steady increase in productivity and the crop modelers weren't so sure. So the cool thing about those workshops is we could force them into those conversations, which, you know, they had expressed an interest in having, but needed a mechanism to make that work.
Great, thank you. So I saw one question from one of our participants, Denisa, and I know she's from the European Institute, and then actually a large portion of our GLASSNET participants are from European. And she asked a question about the advices for early careers in the European countries. I don't know if any of the speakers have any experience that. The original question, if Denisa, you're online, you want to repeat yourself, or otherwise I can do it for you. He said, could anyone? Yeah, you're online.
I can also do it online, of course, myself. Hello, my name is Denisa Angelova. I'm a postdoc at CMCC in Italy. And of course, thank you for your talks, the three of them. They were very, very nice, very informative. I was asking myself, how do you actually see the interdisciplinarity development in Europe? And if you have some specific advice to postdocs like me in a European country. I know that, of course, you have somewhat limited experience, but still your perspective would be appreciated. Thank you.
Tom.
I happen to be on sabbatical right now in Europe, in Germany, in visiting PIC, and I haven't yet visited CMCC, but I hope to do that. So I thought I could make a couple of comments from this perspective. One, there's some awesome interdisciplinary work going on now in Europe. I'm seeing it in here in Germany, but also elsewhere. The EU projects tend to be very interdisciplinary in addition to being international. So I think there's some great opportunities, but I've also seen that within the universities, maybe they haven't progressed as far as in the US, or maybe that's just the German universities, I don't know, that there do seem to be significant barriers to interdisciplinary work at the university level. So, Denise said the fact that you're at CMCC is a good sign. I think that's just one observation I wanted to make. Seems like there's some great opportunities through the research institutes, also through some of the EU-funded projects, but within the universities, I sense things haven't progressed as far as in the US, where any dean, department head, certainly president of a university you talk to, it's all about interdisciplinary stuff, and it's a question of how do we get people going in that direction, and the funding is there and whatnot. I'll be quiet, Jing. Maybe the others want to contribute as well.
I'll just say a very quick word, which is, my impression, and I know this isn't a universal rule, but the PhD process in the EU tends to be a little bit faster. Like you get your PhD in 3 or 4 years, whereas in the United States, it might be 5 or 6. And I think that puts a higher emphasis on the postdoctoral positions that you get, maybe 2 or 3 of them. So I think there's might have a little bit of a different experience around that. But there are, as Tom was mentioning, I was looking at the building behind you, Tom, in your virtual background. Yeah, that's a good place to go at PIC, and a couple other places that are really standing out. But I do think the biggest difference from an institutional standpoint are the European-wide proposal processes. They really are much more interdisciplinary. We have had many of what I consider, great ideas coming out of AgNIP that we could not find a US funding agency to support. If I talk climate change and agriculture, wearing, my NASA hat, people say, okay, well, it's agriculture, go talk to USDA, but it's climate change, go talk to NOAA, but you're a NASA person, go up the chain at NASA. And at that funding level, it's very difficult. And the interdisciplinary grants at NSF are really, really challenging. You have to give Tom and his team a great credit for getting one of these NSF network of networks. There were hundreds and hundreds of proposals with only a few selected. So it's challenging to get the funding in the US, but the institutions are starting to catch up. Whereas I would say in Europe, you have a little bit of the opposite problem, which is the funding is ahead of the institutions.
Thank you.
Great suggestions. We'll move on unless Ben or Kathy have further comments. No? Okay, good. And then I saw another question actually from Tom for Alex about how do you continue to make people enthused and engage with this multidisciplinary. You addressed those briefly, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, I think I folded some of his question into my discussion of the workshops and how we do that. But maybe I'll just mention, we have principles within AgNIP that are very much supporting the inclusivity that I'm talking about. So it's written into our charter, for example, that if you provide data, we will include you on the paper. So we're not kind of an extractive group. And when we're organizing our workshop, it's not just me making the agenda. We have a whole leaders forum. People who lead all those activities come together to help make it happen. And then we also give significant leeway to people so that the leaders of the wheat team can organize an AgNIP wheat meeting without having to approve everything through our central coordination. So we are, like I said, more of a coordination at your disposal than a dictatorial coordination group. And I think especially in interdisciplinary research, that's important.
Cool. And yeah, how to so let's see. I think these are Alex's responses to the questions. And yeah, I have one question for all possible speakers. And then, so some of our early careers cannot find a position when they are trying to find their job. So I know some academia jobs still prefer like a disciplinary work more than the interdisciplinary. So do you have any advices for them to explore the landscape of jobs? Yeah.
I can start since I haven't said anything in a moment. I know it's hard out there. Having, I'm continuing to write letters for folks, and I've still got a couple of students that I'm trying to finish up that are on the PhD track. It's particularly difficult when, we talked about both Kathy and Alex and I talked about our belief that there's this, really big importance about disciplinary excellence and everything else. You're doing your PhD. You also, in addition to that, you focus in on a topic, usually, at least a common thread, maybe across some different work, water, so climate, something or other, right? Whatever it is. I've got a student right now who spent a lot of time working on water quality and nutrient loss and some of the things that Kathy talked about over the course of her PhD, and did excellent work. Everybody wants people to do climate stuff right now. That's the hot thing. Or maybe energy and climate, or something like that. I haven't seen a whole lot of water, focused jobs. These people are interested in, right? I can do climate. I'm interested in climate, even though I've been working on water, and some of that stuff carries over, but it can be really hard, I think, to break through, and really frustrating. There's always a stochastic, unfortunately, I think, element to the job market, just certain resumes rise to the top, or some people have contacts, and something gets looked at a little bit closer than somebody else in the stack. I feel like there's a diversity of opportunities out there that is perhaps broader than in the past. This speaks to also the question I think Danielle asked to me, and I wrote a response about that. There seem to be more and more opportunities with NGOs, or with more, I guess what I would call a think tank type groups, like the group in Italy, or like PIC, or whatever it might be, or in the US. You have groups like, I don't know, Resources for the Future, or something like that. Or if you're on the economic side, or maybe on the, in the international development and environment space, there's more and more organizations, but also NGOs that haven't traditionally done as much work with, stakeholders and farmers, and we're more policy oriented, I think, are doing more of that kind of work if you're interested in agriculture and working in that space. So there's opportunities with Nature Conservancy, and there's more opportunities, I think, with those kinds of groups. That may not be satisfying if you want an academic job, or you want to be on the academic track. The other role seems to be a growing legion of these soft-funded research folks at universities, whether they're attached to research institutes, interdisciplinary institutes, Kathy could probably speak to this, or just large, successful labs and groups and networks within the university that constantly have projects, and they need folks. That may describe Jing and the work that Jing does, and kind of the role she's been playing for the last several years. There's an instability to that, I'm sure, and it's not for everybody. I don't think I would want to be constantly writing proposals and things like that. But if you're teamed up with a really successful group of scientists and folks like that, I think your quality of life could actually be better than than somebody on the tenure track. Certainly that could be the case in an NGO or a government role or something like that. I don't know, maybe that's helpful, maybe not, but those are a few thoughts anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably, Danielle, your question is kind of overlapping with that as well. Not every job is for tenure track, and then there may be different paths to do relevant disciplinary works. You want to share more experience or elaborate?
I was going to say that answered my question exactly. I want a discussion around that, because so far we've just been talking a lot about I think what people consider the conventional academic path through tenure and whatnot, but there's so many ways that people do research now, right? There's national labs, there's these, as you said, soft-funded research positions, there's different institutes and things that do research. So I think sometimes if it feels limiting trying to find somewhere that will accept you as an interdisciplinary science, maybe you need to look outside of some of the classic, established tenure track positions, if that's really, because there's more out there.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add one thing here. We haven't really talked about it yet, but there's also getting out of academia into private sector. I'll lump government labs into academia in the sense that we're trying to publish papers, but Private sector, I think one thing to be cautious of for early career researchers is private sector are often trying to create a product. And in many cases, there is a repetitive application of a good product. So for example, if you develop a new tool or a new method, you then go around the world saying, how many different places can we get people to pay us to apply this method? And just be cautious of whether you're in a role that is basically just turning the same crank over and over and over again, or if you're in a role that's developing something new. Because if you have that curiosity of wanting to do new research, you can get stuck in the kind of consulting role where you're just applying old research over and over and over again. Now that can be actually quite lucrative if you're in the right place. It also allows you sometimes to develop stakeholder engagements where you become like the partner of a major government, or the mayor's office, or who knows what it would be. But it is a different lifestyle choice, and some people really love it. And some people can hop back and forth between the two, but again, it kind of goes back to the academic credentials. If you have a couple papers under your belt before you go to the private sector, it will be easier to come back than if you go immediately into the private sector with no publication record. Then it's more difficult to come back.
Excellent. For our participants, I'm putting in the chat a link to a very short survey for you to complete, maybe after this workshop, to give us some feedback for us to improve in the future. And so I think we'll continue the discussion and address some of the questions, particularly for Ben. And I think the first one comes from Tom. So he wants to ask the costs and benefits of leading and being a part of the members.
Yes, this is maybe a tightrope we all walk. So I think I mentioned that I haven't been sort of the PI or whatever on the project. I think on any of these big teams that I've been on, especially ones that really spread across different disciplines. That's not necessarily for lack of trying. I have certainly plenty of rejected proposals where I led the team. So keep that in mind, especially the junior folks around us, right? We all have those proposals, and we all have those journal articles and everything else in our closets. That said, there's a real trade-off between thinking about sort of being the PI versus being maybe part of the executive committee or whatever, if it's a large project, right? The leadership team, I think was the way you described it. I really enjoy that role of being sort of, over an objective of the project, or maybe right now I'm in an NSF project, or rather a big NIFA Sustainable Ag Systems project, where I'm sort of the lead of the modeling group, and there's multiple different models and people doing different things, and they're not all economists or anything else, but I get to focus in kind of on a subset of stuff that I'm most knowledgeable about, most passionate about. Also, I probably have more insights about the details of than other components of the project. It's still a lot of breadth, a lot of different folks and different institutions, and a lot of coordination to make things work. So it still requires a lot of leadership and effort, but I don't get drawn into as much time management. I don't need to travel and go do the annual meeting, and yeah, I'm going to need to contribute reporting and everything else, to the annual reports, and I'm going to have to keep us moving ahead on our objectives that are germane to the subgroup that we're working with. But it's a way to take on a leadership role, and I think get all the benefits you get probably without a lot of the headaches, maybe, from being the overall lead. That said, thinking about other roles, especially roles, more junior folks, my approach as a junior person coming into this area who sort of had an explicit mandate to try to do interdisciplinary work and get on teams and write proposals and things like that was, I'm going to bring disciplinary excellence, sort of that idea of you're coming out of your PhD, you should be a technical expert in your field. I'm not going to bring a huge body of work that's going to say, okay, this person has this huge track record. There's other more senior folks and people that have experience leading and organizing and doing all of those things. And their reputations are going to be part of what's going to be needed to secure the project. But I'm providing something really important and basic to the project and its success, right? You can learn, again, sort of how teams work, how different people lead, without needing to get, again, engaged in even as much work as sort of a middle management, if you want to think about that sort of leadership team role that I just described, right? You're probably not going to get drawn into meeting with an underperforming person on the team that's working in your group, right? You're going to be blissfully ignorant of that, which is great, as it should be, especially if you're on the tenure track or doing whatever else you're doing as trying to get your dissertation published or whatever early in your career. I don't know, hopefully that answers sort of the thought about different roles and leadership.
Thank you. Yeah. So I do have another question for Ben. So in the middle of some answers you gave, you talk about the topic, like now everybody wants to do climate change, and then maybe a few years ago, biofuel stuff or water stuff. And then also Alex mentioned this as well about chasing the relevance. So my question is for the early careers, how do they make sure they are tracking this research in trends and kind of improve their sensitivity to what could be the next area they can heavily invest their efforts and time? Yeah.
I have one quick thought, then I'll let others maybe weigh in. I mean, that's hard, right? We all wish we had a crystal ball and we could latch on to the next big thing or the next three big things. You get lucky in some ways. I think as a junior person, hopefully sort of that sharing of responsibility and reputational effects and other things I was just talking about, hopefully some of that is you benefiting from foresight of the people who are maybe leading some of those initial initiatives, or your postdoc advisor or somebody else who thinks strategically about some of those kinds of things, and then you start to get exposure to them. I don't know that I have any silver bullet here aside from when there are seminars, webinars, workshops you can go participate in, especially to present even your more narrow focused research or something that you're working on. Participate in as many of those as you can early on, because you get exposure to so many other things that are going on that just they're necessarily outside your focus on a given day, and especially small workshops rather than big conferences, if there are such things that you can get to, or something that's much more workshop, working group oriented, maybe like the structure that Alex described for the AgMIP workshop relative to other conferences that we go to. That's just a way that you just see the churn, the ideas, what's going on, what are people doing, what aren't people doing, if there's a gap and you want to try and find something that somebody else isn't working on, or a connection that people aren't making. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I often give early career researchers the advice that they need a small community and a large community. So, go to AGU or one of these, big conferences so you can see the breadth of what's out there. And when I go to AGU, I go to several sessions that are in my area, and then I always find one or two that are just like to refresh my curiosity as a scientist. I'll go to something completely different. And sometimes it's amazing that you find a connection just by getting outside the box. But it's that small community, what Ben was just saying, where you can actually get to know the more senior people. Smaller communities are more likely to take the time to get to know the graduate students than the big communities would. And you can find a potential mentor or advisor from there. The other thing that I'll add to this mix is at a certain point, interdisciplinary research is about meeting some societal need or some stakeholders' need. So talk to those people, figure out whether the information that they're getting is actually enough for them to make the decisions they're making. And if not, what are they missing? That's going to point you in the right direction. And if you can orient your research around that identified need, that goes a long way.
Excellent. Okay, does anyone have any leftover questions? We have a couple more minutes to address them. So I hope I have covered all the questions put in the chat box. And yeah, I think we had a very good discussion after the talks. If no more questions, yeah, I would say really appreciate the speakers for their wonderful talks, and there were so many amazing questions people were asking. I think that's greatly extended the points they raised in their talks. And for any people who wasn't able to participate this workshop, Holly will share a link and for them to revisit the videos. Unfortunately, we had to do this first thing in the morning. So I know people may not be able to join us. And then if you're interested in other GLASSNET events, try to subscribe on news letters or our mailing list, and Holly is the contact can help with those. And then yeah, we hope to stay connected with you. And also Tom is the PI of the GLASSNET, so we'll have more exciting events to be announced in the future. And yeah, thank you all for attending our workshop, and for our speakers, thank you very much for your time. And I think we learned a lot from all of you, and it will be extremely helpful for the early careers.